Sir, we are live, sir. Sir, you can start.
Yeah. Just give me 1 minute. Good day to all those who tuned in. Welcome to Anekdhara's webinar on Unpacking New Welfarism, a political economy analysis. State and its role in the welfare of the ruled has always engaged the attention of the rulers, thinkers, and public at large. Ashoka, the great Mauryan king, who ruled more than 2000 years ago, exhorted his officers through his edicts that welfare of the people is his primary concern. I quote from one edict. Beloved of the gods speaks thus. I wish to see that everything I consider to be proper is carried out in the right way. And I consider instructing you to be the best way of accomplishing this. All men are my children, and what I desire for my own children, I desire their welfare and happiness both in this world and in the next. That I desire for all men. At the other extreme is the famous statement usually attributed to King Louis XIV of France, "L'État, c'est moi," which means I am the state. So whatever a king's welfare is the state's welfare, indirectly. Over the years, welfare state has evolved and through a system of institutions. The welfare state has evolved over time, with extreme examples being of laissez-faire, non-intervention of the state in the markets, to the other extreme of socialist states like the former USSR, which ideally aimed at controlling all assets and taking care of all the needs of its citizens. In India, welfare state, social welfare was part of the ethos of the freedom struggle, and we can be seen in multiple dimensions of constitutional, political, and economic. Our constitutional frameworks introduced directive principles of state policy. Though they are not justiciable, they indicate an affirmative action, and a few of them are secure a social order for promotion of welfare of people, minimize inequalities, and ownership and control of material resources, so that the community serves a common interest. Another aspect of Indian polity is the universal health suffrage, and thus the need to attract every individual voter is crucial for political survival. In an economy where economic inequality and deprivation is glaring, any spending on social welfare will definitely attract votes. In addition, modern technology has enabled direct access to the people in transferring the benefits, either through DBT schemes or more streamlined screening mechanisms. Thus, welfare spending has become hallmark of all political parties. Of course, it is economic rationale which one has to look into. The choice between social welfare spending and developing assets for long-term use. Is welfare spending a remedy, a term used by our Honorable Prime Minister, implying reckless spending on social welfare? When does welfare spending become productive? When is it a largesse or a millstone? How should taxpayers assess welfare measures with reference to tax collections? And are governments and political parties in competitive federalism draining wealth of the state? Addressing all these questions is crucial for us as the economy has to grow equitably. To address these issues and much more, we have Ms Yamini Iyer, President and CEO of Center for Policy Research. Yamini's work sits at the intersection of research and policy practice, and her research interests span in the fields of public finance, social policy, state capacity, federalism, and governance, and the study of contemporary politics in India. She has published widely in academic publications and the popular press, and writes regularly on current affairs and policy matters in mainstream Indian newspapers. In 2008, she founded the Accountability Initiative at CPR, which is credited with pioneering one of the largest expenditure tracking surveys for elementary education. Yamini serves on a number of government and inter-policy boards. Her recent policy commitment include Commissioner for and Chair of Governance Working Group, Lands and Commissioning on Reimagining India's Health, and she is also Technical Advisory Group, National Data Analytics Platform, Ms Iyer. Yamini is alumna of London School of Economics, St. Edmund's College, Cambridge University, and St. Stephen's College, Delhi University. And with such eminent personality, I think we'll be able to see some light at the end of to all the questions that are posed. Thank you, madam, for accepting our invite, and over to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, madam. We are able to hear.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure and privilege for me to be here to talk to you about a subject that is very close to my heart, the nature of the Indian welfare state. I have been a participant and a student of India's welfare state for over 2 decades now, starting my career in the early 2000s, just as the experiments of expansion of India's welfare state had begun with the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act being passed, subsequently the Right to Education being passed, the National Rural Health Mission of the central government unfolding. And over the course of this now nearly 2 decades, I've had the privilege of being able to observe the kind of transitions and changes that India's welfare state have undergone. Some that I think in our popular discourse, when we talk about welfare, and often label it in using words like freebies, raveries, even subsidies, we tend to miss really the very fundamental dynamics of what is underway in India, and particularly in terms of what the welfare state or the architecture of the welfare state does to our imaginations of who we are as citizens, and what are as citizens, the rights and obligations that we have towards this, that the state has towards us as citizens. So, in fact, for me, a lot of how we think about the role of the welfare state, the way it delivers public services to all citizens, but more specifically to the poor, tells us a lot about how we as a society are building our sets of expectations on the state, what are moral obligations of the state towards us, and what are things that we, in the nature of our public discourse, put out as vote-buying efforts or freebies and raveries and subsidies, etc. Welfare also, in a very poor country like India, tells us an immense amount about the nature of our politics and the dynamics of party politics in particular, and how political leaders use welfare policy as a mechanism to signal to their voters. And in that sense, welfare therefore also gives us a very important indicator, in my view, of the health and nature of Indian democracy. So with that preamble, I'm going to focus my talk today very much on some of the key elements of the welfare state of the government of India as it is unfolding today. So I'm going to take you very firmly back into the contemporary moment rather than give you a historical analysis, and identify some of the key characteristics of welfare as I see it today and some of the challenges of this welfare as I see it today. But I'm sure in the Q&A, if you we can take a step back and look at some elements of welfare and the evolution of the welfare state as it did in the past. So may I request that the PPT that I had sent just be put up? So if you can go to the next slide. So let me begin in the contemporary moment by placing the welfare state as it exists today into some amount of context as I understand it. In my understanding, the nature of the welfare state as it exists today in India is particularly unique compared to what we see of the evolution of welfare states and the frameworks within which welfare states had evolved in many other parts of the world, but more specifically in Western Europe, which really was the home of the evolution of welfare states and what eventually sort of coalesced around what we call social democracy. And the unique element about welfare in India today is that there is a large and critical focus. It's not on the provision of what economists often call private goods via public funding, so housing, toilets, food, etc., and far less focus on pure public goods that are the core obligation of what governments are supposed to do. Mind you, in pure economic theory, you seek governmental intervention where markets fail or markets can fail in ways that don't generate social good. So we divide goods into public goods, merit goods, and private goods. And what's really puzzling about India is, given that it is now a 75-year-old democracy, its welfare state doesn't actually privilege these public goods in the same way as it privileges the private delivery of public goods. The public financing of private goods. It does this, and you can see it in the electoral rhetoric when governments go to people. They will talk about free food, as Prime Minister Modi does. Look at all the Modi ki guarantees. It's free food. It's free cooking gas. It's toilets. There is almost a conspicuous silence around things like health and education. And when health and education are picked up, what are the big flagships? It's Ayushman Bharat, which in some senses is a cash transfer or equivalent of insurance, but is not talking about the larger public system of primary care, which is the basis on which most other countries in the world, bar the United States, which doesn't have a very good health system, and in fact has a relatively thin welfare architecture, has. So the discourse around welfare is not a discourse on public systems and public goods and merit goods. It's a discourse that has evolved around private goods that are publicly financed. And I've puzzled a lot about this because it's a question that is often asked: how is it that in a democracy, these very fundamental elements of human capital just are not part and parcel of what politicians and voters engage with each other in the marketplace of elections for? And I want to posit two basic theories of what I call two disenchantments that the Indian public has vis-a-vis the Indian economy and the Indian state. The first disenchantment is with the economic trajectory, particularly the ability of the Indian economy since it began to grow in the 1990s, which is also when the welfare project started expanding, with its ability to develop a foundation of an economy in which there is equal opportunity for all. India has amongst the highest rates of youth unemployment compared to any other parts of the world, and it has amongst the lowest rates of labor force participation for a country at the level of demography that India has. More importantly, as we know from the periodic labor force survey data of the government of India, even when it comes, one of the most stark elements of the unemployment data is the fact that unemployment is highest amongst educated graduate youth in India rather than uneducated youth, suggesting that there is something about the Indian economy that is simply unable to provide jobs at the pace and rate at which India needs it. Just today, the government has released via a press release, so it's very thin right now, but data from the latest consumption expenditure survey. And you can see, I mean, on average, the rural Indian monthly daily per capita income expenditure is at 46 rupees. It's such a huge, the rising inequality is another very significant element of what the economic trajectory has failed to do. And politics is not disabused of this. It recognizes it and it knows it has to respond. But that response has been very unique. It hasn't been a response that is a response that looks at what is it about our investments in people, the nature of our human capital, and the nature of what the Indian economy needs that we are not able to fulfill. In fact, it doesn't address what I would argue is the most critical structural constraint in the Indian economy. So if you look at the growth story of India, you'll see that our big growth trajectory kicked off in the 1990s in an unusual way compared to most other parts of the world, which see a structural transformation as people move out from agriculture into what we call the modern economy. In India, people moved out of agriculture straight into the source of growth, rather, went away from agriculture straight into high-end services, more or less skipping the middle part of the economy, low-skilled manufacturing, which for a country with a large population was critical in order to be able to employ large numbers of youth. High-end services require high levels of education. We were able to provide, we had a top layer of skilled services. So many of all of us whose lives improved economically manifold once liberalization took place. Our incomes increased in ways that were unimaginable in our parents' generation because we were able to ride that tide of high-end services, but we got stuck on the low-end manufacturing, and the bulk of jobs that pulled people out of agriculture, actually even in the peak growth years of 7 to 8%, were jobs that were created in the informal construction sector, which leave workers precarious. These are not formal jobs. These are short-term contractual employment, which means that people are constantly moving between agriculture and construction and moving back into agriculture when they don't have enough opportunities. So this kind of that big movement out of poverty in the early 2000s took place on the back of construction and trickle down of high-end services. It did not take place on the back of creating large numbers of jobs for the bulk of the Indian economy, that middle layer, which remains today informal and unorganized. Approximately 80% of the Indian economy remains in that space. So what does the welfare state do then as response? It hasn't addressed this very structural issue of full employment. It hasn't addressed this very structural issue of what the realities of the labor market are. Instead, it has acquired what the economist Ratan Roy has sort of phrased as a compensatory logic. A logic that says, in the absence of the ability of providing you jobs, we will use fiscal policy to provide you certain kinds of consumption smoothing cash, and that also consumption smoothing in kind welfare. This is compensation for the failure of the economy, not in the way in which welfare, as we have known it, particularly in Western Europe, where welfare has largely served as a critical redistributive role. And when you don't think of welfare as redistribution, it does not allow you to create cross-class solidarities or universality of welfare provisioning, which is at the heart of what builds social consensus around welfare provisioning. I use the word welfare, not social policy, precisely because welfare is about the well-being of all citizens, rather than governmental policy that is targeted at specific citizens. What we have in this logic of compensatory welfare today is a logic that targets specific citizens as compensation for the failure of the economy to create enabling conditions for everybody to participate. The second element of this disenchantment is the reality of what has often been described as the flailing Indian state, the low-capacity Indian state, the incompetent Indian state. The phrase flailing is often used by many of us who study the Indian state. It's a phrase that was devised by the economist Land Pritchett, who said that the Indian state is flailing, as in the head is able to devise policy, but the head is not quite able to control through the sinews and the nerves, the fingers and the toes, to do what is required of it in alignment with that policy. And so you have policy that says X and implementation that is completely divorced from the goals and realities of that policy. Just a sort of a very tactile way of describing one of the most fundamental challenges that all of us have experienced with the Indian state after the 1991 economic growth phase. There was the author Gurcharan Das came out with a book that was titled India Grows at Night While the State Sleeps, which in some ways kind of captures the exhaustion and disenchantment that all of us as citizens have always consistently felt with the state's inability to do the most fundamental basic public service provisions. Most of us who live in urban areas rely very much on private services for security, for even electricity. We all have generators. If you live in Delhi, you now have to even privatize your air to be able to breathe. So we all have air purifiers if we can afford it, and lock up ourselves in our homes on days of high pollution. It's all about the things that the state fails to do, which then we seek services for in the private sector. And it is a sense of disenchantment with the state that has also fundamentally reduced the nature of our discourse in Indian society around taxation. Some years ago, I wrote a paper with Lan Pritchett, in fact, and in more ways than one, the title describes exactly how we think about the challenge of welfare and redistribution in India. We title the paper "Taxes as the Price of Civilization" or "Taxes as a Tribute to the Leviathan." Let me for a moment just explain what I mean here. The reality of India's taxation structure is that it is heavily dependent on, and unusually so for a country at our level of GDP, dependent on indirect taxation rather than direct taxation, income taxes. And any debate and discourse on things like wealth taxes, etc., immediately gets stopped. And it is our proposition that one of the reasons why a discourse around taxation is hard to have, a genuine discourse around taxation and redistribution. If you look, for example, at the evolution of Europe, you see that the big shift, actually, the democratic shift, the social democratic shift that took place in Europe, took place on account of progressive taxation that took from the extremely wealthy and redistributed via health and education primarily, and other forms of infrastructure building to the bulk of society. That kind of conversation is getting harder and harder to have in India because there is a strong view, a strong sense that the state actually, its capability to deliver is limited. And so people don't see taxes as a price of civilization, which is what the fundamental sort of social contract of taxation was about, that we allow the state to extract resources from us to deliver better public goods to all of us. And taxes instead are seen as a tribute to the Leviathan, to the potentate who wants to extract from us but not give back. I just saw today on Twitter, for example, as Bangalore is going to increase its property tax rates starting 1st of April, and various people were writing about how this is extracting from the, looting the middle class to feed the corrupt politician. So this reality of the failed state or the flailing state, the competent state, has made it very hard to have a genuine discourse in India, given the degrees of inequality we have in this country, to have a discourse around taxation as a route to redistribution. In fact, the argument always is cut corporate tax, reduce direct taxes. Some of the big policy moves that this government, Modi government, has made has been in this direction. And so that has sort of constrained our imagination of how we think about welfare. The third element of welfare, as it has evolved in India of recent, particularly in the last 10 years, is the sort of, given this reality of a state that doesn't deliver, there is a hesitation, given this reality of people not wanting to engage in a discourse on taxation and redistribution in a robust way, which feeds from the low capacity state, there is increasingly a recognition that, well, there are some things that politicians have to do, and we can't allow the poorest of the poor to have nothing. So in that compensatory logic, the best way to provide that welfare is not in investing in our public systems, rather it is in using technology, what I call the digi-state, the digital state, as a vehicle to better transfer cash into bank accounts of the poor. So the bulk of welfare as we see it today, and the bulk of the discourse around welfare as we see it today, particularly in the hurly-burly of electoral politics, is not a welfare that is talking about building better schools, better hospitals, better primary health centers, improved nutrition. This is a welfare architecture that is talking about guarantees of all kinds, which are largely these kinds of cash transfer guarantees that are given to the poorest. So in some senses, the consensus of new welfarism in India today is a consensus that recognizing welfare in an economy that is not able to generate jobs is an unavoidable palliative. It's like a political necessity, but it does not engage in critical questions of equality, of full citizenship, where the role of welfare is meant to be a role which mediates between state and society. For those to have a kind of base of social protection for all people, a base of risk protection for all people as they seek full employment in the economy. This is really genuinely unique. No welfare system in any part of the world, developing or developed, has evolved in this way. If you look at, for example, the East Asian economic miracle that we often refer to in the Indian discourse, if you look at China and its own economic miracle, all of these economic miracles were built on what we call productive welfare, welfare that sought to actively invest in human capital, to mobilize people to be part of the economy. In India, we are generating a welfare that is not about mobilizing people to be part of the Indian economy. It is a welfare that is about mobilizing people to say, given that you can't be part of the Indian economy, this is the limited compensatory support that we can give to ensure that you have food on the table. Therefore, giving free food to 800 crore Indians is an absolute essential for political parties, even those that claim that welfare is quote unquote raveries. So that's the framework in which the welfare system has evolved in India today. May we move to the next slide? So I just wanted to digress for a moment here to say one thing. In terms of how much government is spending on welfare. So I'm presenting to you here data from the government of India. This is since 2009, we have accumulated the share of social sector expenditure that includes education and health, as well as many cash transfers, or as a percentage of total government expenditure. And even as we say that there is an increased focus on welfare, particularly in the political discourse. Again, if you look at the advertisements for the elections and all the guarantees that we see, what is really stark is that, in fact, the share of social sector expenditure has remained static as a percentage of total Government of India expenditure, with the exception of 2020-21, when expenditure went up to 30%. That was on account of the increased expenditure in Narega and PMJKY, the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana. Can we go to the next slide? Again, as you can see here, this looks at expenditures on subsidies. And here again, you will see the same story, that you see more or less actually significant cuts in expenditure on subsidies to the poor, with the exception of subsidies that were given during COVID-19. So just another way of describing the same phenomenon. The reason I wanted to highlight this to you is to demonstrate that the way in which welfare gets prioritized in politics doesn't translate into a significantly large contribution of government expenditure into welfare. So, on health and education, India spends far lower than any comparable country at our levels of GDP, far lower. Since 1964, we have been saying that India should spend 6% of GDP. Kothari Commission said so on school education. We are only at 4% today. Since Bhore Committee report in 1945, we have been saying significantly higher percentage of expenditure on health. We are still at less than 2% of GDP despite COVID. But even on social transfers, on these cash transfers, in fact, World Bank's calculations suggest, these are slightly dated, but given that we haven't seen that much change in expenditure, that our expenditure on cash transfers, on social protection transfers is the term the World Bank uses, are far lower than China, Brazil, South Africa, as some useful comparators. So all this talk of welfare, within that, think back to the two disenchantments I talked to you about, particularly vis-a-vis taxes and redistribution. You aren't seeing a particularly large, generous contribution of taxation into spending on welfare, even though we are constantly worrying about what welfare schemes announcements are going to do to the fiscal health of the Government of India. If you look closely at budgets in the last 4 or 5 years, particularly in the last 4 years after COVID and during and after COVID, you see a very clear switch towards capital expenditure over revenue expenditure, but the denominator has remained more or less the same in terms of the overall pool of government expenditure as a percentage of GDP. So we are not a generous country when it comes to social sector expenditure, even if it is one of the most critical pieces of what we talk about during elections. And now, if we can turn to the next slide, talk a little bit about what I see as two kind of distinctions of the welfare architecture as it has evolved in the last few years, over the last 2 decades. I think the first big transition, as I see it, was a transition that was initiated in 2005-06 with NREGA in particular, a transition that emerged with the role of the judiciary playing an important role and civil society playing an important role in trying to build what we call the rights-based welfare state. This resulted in national legislation in the form of the right to work through the NREGA, the right to education, and the right to food through the National Food Security Act. And there was something quite distinctive about the principle of the rights-based welfare. The distinctive element of the principle of the rights-based welfare were two. One, that it was very much pushing government by virtue of articulating welfare as a right, using the language of rights into welfare as an articulation that said that it is crucial for the state to, the sociologist uses the phrase expansion of the surface area of the state. So just a more significant presence of the state by virtue of greater investment. But in addition, that investment was being made within the grammar of rights. So it was on a basic foundational normative principle that welfare is an obligation that the state has to provide citizens, and citizens have a right to demand accountability from the state for that welfare. And I think that was a very, very important attempt at shifting the citizen-state dynamic. Welfare until then had always been framed in the sort of charity framework. The Garibi Hatao framework of the 1970s and 1980s very much saw welfare as the Mai Baap Sarkar handing out patronage to its citizens. And this was trying to introduce a new language of rights into this and using mechanisms of the right to information, for instance, social auditing, as ways of empowering citizens to actually directly place claims on the state. So the lady here, this is a picture from a social audit I was once a participant in, asking questions of the district magistrate about wages that weren't delivered. A very, very different kind of imagination of what welfare would do, but also a different kind of imagination on how to build state capacity, because it isn't that the state capacity was particularly capable back in the early 2000s when this rights-based welfare was being delivered, but an imagination that saw that state capacity being built through pressure of people and not necessarily through the means of technology. In fact, technology didn't quite exist there. But that was the imagination of that first wave of expansion of the rights-based welfare. And it is in that phase of expansion that you did see some marginal increases in overall government of India and state government spending on welfare. If we can move to the next slide. Over this last decade, there has been a significant shift in the imagination of welfare, particularly in the government of India, which I'm going to emphasize here. But I do want to say this is not unique to the government of India. You see signs of this in state governments too. It is a reframing of the idea of welfare, what I call the Labharti welfare, that has kind of pitted the rights-based welfare as a welfare of quote-unquote entitlement, and the Labharti welfare, and I'll explain what I mean about that in a moment, as the welfare of empowerment. And it is a very unique kind of definition of welfare that Prime Minister Modi has articulated, along with others, senior officials of the government have articulated in different speeches, but an articulation that often gets lost in all the ravery versus not so ravery kind of public discourse that we have. In the framing, rights have kind of been eliminated from this conversation. Instead, we are talking about welfare as a means of empowerment where citizens have sets of duties towards their own welfare. So in a speech in 2015, Prime Minister Modi had talked about the poor needing to be empowered to fight poverty on their own strength, and this sort of teach them to fish framework. This was further fleshed out in many speeches that he gave later as well. And I've got here a quote from an interview by the Home Minister where he says, "We've provided them gas connections, power connections. It's up to them to pay their bills, to maintain the toilets, to upgrade their lives. This is how we define empowerment." So there is a much more kind of intersection of duties of citizens vis-a-vis the public goods, the private goods that the state has given the citizen. And I think that the use of the word given is very distinct from the use of the word rights. And that is something that we need to pay attention to, as I'll articulate in the next two slides before I finish. May we go to the next slide? So what is this Labharti welfare? There are four characteristics of this Labharti welfare that I want to identify here. One, its focus on private goods. I have already spoken about this at the cost of public goods. Its excessive reliance on technology, so building the digital public infrastructure as the investment that is to be made rather than the traditional public system as the investment that has been made. It is using the framework of efficiency, which is not something that is apolitical. And I leave it there because I hope we can talk about this a little bit in the Q&A. It is using the word as the framework of efficiency that is built into this idea of a direct transfer of cash. It is delivering to this new category of beneficiary in North Indian, in Hindi now, the phrase Labharti or beneficiary or recipient actually is the actual translation, has now become part and parcel of the lexicon. It's almost like a new category. The Labharti Varg category has been created now as part of the framework of welfare. And what's important about this Labharti Varg are two elements. One, that if you look at who is the beneficiary now is being identified not by caste, which is unique, but by different kinds of categories of citizens. So women, unemployed youth, type of skill, age, as categories of beneficiaries, not around the active acknowledgement or presence of the intersection of caste and economic well-being that had traditionally been used as categorizations. Or even for that matter, of more importantly, a specific articulation of income, which used to be the below poverty line, above poverty line used to be the primary basis. That has kind of shifted out of the policy discourse increasingly. The second element of the Labharti category is that it is essentially mobilizing people around the idea of being a recipient of a welfare benefit, rather than mobilizing people around specific rights or group rights or categories of individual rights that citizens have traditionally politically been mobilized around caste, around gender, around ethnicity, around religion. It is actually seeking to transcend these categories to create this category of the beneficiary. And if we can move to the next slide, the importance of that category of beneficiary. Can we move to the next slide? The importance of that category of the beneficiary is that it plays a really important role in the nature of our politics today, what I call the politics of attribution. So let me just for a moment explain what I mean here, and then I will stop. I was traveling around rural Uttar Pradesh before about a year ago, talking to women about welfare programs and benefits that they have received over the course of the year. And one of the interesting things was that a woman at some point, got up and said, ye mila, wo unka photo bhi wahan pe hamesha hota hai. So then when I probed, we discovered that she was talking about the Prime Minister's photo, and then she showed me all the cards, the Shram card, the Ration card, etc., all of which had the Prime Minister's photo. And it reminded me of a very interesting shift that we are seeing in voter surveys. So the Lokniti survey of 2019 saw a very interesting shift in how do voters attribute the delivery of schemes to which political party at which level of government, state or center. And there is comparative data on this. And one of the most interesting things about this is that this attribution, which used to in the past be very much aligned to attribution or to the state government, because it is the state government that does the delivery and it is the state government officials that workers see, is now for central schemes increasingly shifting to the government of India, but more specifically to the Prime Minister. So the photo matters significantly. I have a picture here of our finance minister who made headlines about a year ago in Telangana at a ration shop when she saw that the Prime Minister's picture wasn't there. And this was a photograph from the newspapers of her berating the district magistrate for not putting the picture of the Prime Minister who was singularly responsible for delivering the free grain Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana. So the Labharti work is very much about building this very direct emotive connect between the political leadership and the voter. So the photograph, for instance, matters a lot. And it is in that narrative that when you talk to people now, increasingly they say, Ration hame Ghelot se mila, Ration hame Modi se mila, gas hame Modi se mila. So the framework in which the citizen now talks about welfare has become a framework of the Labharti, and the relationship between the Labharti and the leadership of the political structure. And one of the things to think about in this is it is entirely feasible that this may well be a far more efficient way of delivering at least some transfers to the poor relative to the past, where there used to be hosts of intermediaries who were also part and parcel of the nexus of corruption that would reduce benefits to people. But the rights framework sought to address this through an imagination of an empowered citizenry that was making claims on government and demanding their benefits. The Labharti framework views this very much in terms of the technology that cuts out all the intermediaries and ensures the delivery. So perhaps it's more efficient, but it's worth asking about, as a provocation, the idea that in this sort of framework of efficiency, are we trading off elements of democratic accountability? Because in a politics that doesn't build that kind of direct engagement with citizens, where the framework of public service delivery and welfare is within the grammar of recipient of the Labharti linked to the populist leader at the top. And by the way, this is not just Modi, states do this too now. It's a politically very, very powerful tool from a vote gathering perspective. So everybody is part of this, all our politics is part of this consensus. But what does it do for what we are demanding of the state? What does it do to our expectations of the state? Are we indeed comfortable with a welfare that is a welfare about being a beneficiary or a recipient, as opposed to welfare that is about rights, that is about an imagination of a society that is based on values of fraternity and equality, that is about a society that builds genuine solidarity through universalization of public services, which is the core of how societies ought to function? Or are we comfortable with the deep inequality of our society, where we can say to assuage ourselves that, well, we have used technology to deliver some cash to the poor, and for the rest, we will carry on in our private schools and our private hospitals and with our private security guards, demanding less and less and less of government. I think that is the fundamental political question that we, all of us here on this group, need to ask ourselves, of what exactly is unfolding in the architecture of the welfare, of this new welfarism today and its political economy. I'll stop there. Thank you. We can switch off the slides.
Thank you, madam. Thanks a lot for your wonderful exposition, especially the distinction between public goods and private goods, and the rights-based approach and empowerment-based approach, and the use of technology. Thanks a lot. There are lots of questions that have come up. I'll just read them out to you, madam, and then we can see how we can segregate them. You pointed out that public systems on health and education has shrunk since 1990s. To what extent would the universal basic income, if and when implemented, compensate the deficit in the public system? So would you like to take this, or you want me to?
Should we take 2 or 3 and try and answer them together?
Yeah, okay. From a practical viewpoint, have we succeeded in judicially enforcing the rights-based welfare, especially with the
Okay.
rights to food and work, and has the judiciary been responsive?
Okay.
How does one improve the public goods like health and education and health? We see them deteriorating rapidly. Are there exceptions to this trend? And optimal welfare in India would involve reducing or eliminating taxes for economically disadvantaged individuals. It's a
Sorry,
common.
can you repeat that?
Optimal welfare in India would involve reducing or eliminating taxes for economically disadvantaged individuals. It's a comment, but implicit is the question key: how does one do that, or is it? And when does social welfare spending become a remedy or a freebie, and when is a merit good, and how does one distinguish this?
Okay, thank you. Let me start with the last question and build up from there. The reverie or freebie question is one that we ask a lot. And let me start by saying I find that question deeply disturbing. I find that the use of those words, which have now become part of the lexicon of how we debate welfare, deeply disturbing. The reason I find it so is because in a country like ours, which has such high levels of extreme inequality, and it still has a significant rural population that lives, for example, of rupees 46 per day, spends a mere rupees 46 per day. The use of words like reverie and freebie when it comes to social, when it comes to any kind of transfer or subsidy that is given to the poor, actually speaks very much to a society that is unwilling to build a social consensus around ideas of equality and fraternity. After all, why do we not use the words freebie and reverie when corporate taxes are cut? Why do we not use the word freebie and reveries when we talk about production-linked incentives, where huge amounts of subsidy are being given to private sector to come up and set up shops, to set up factories? Not all those factories are necessarily designed for increasing jobs. Why do we not use the word reveries or subsidies when we talk about tax breaks that are given to particular sectors to encourage those sectors to come up in the industry? Why do we not talk about reveries and freebies when banks, when large amounts of public money is going to public sector banks to deal for write-offs of banks related to bad loans that have a lot to do with corporate mismanagement? Where are we beginning and ending in a country like ours with the use of the term freebies and subsidies, and whom are we applying those terms to? I think that it requires a much deeper reflection on our part as a collective society, as elites of society, as to why we accept these terms. Having said that, the debate on what kind of subsidies or what kind of investments we should be making in welfare policies is a perfectly fair one, and different there are likely to be different a wide variety of views on this, and I don't think that the way to try and answer that is necessarily to argue good versus bad, as much as to argue why is it that we are only emphasizing one and not the other. And that's the kind of engagement I have tried to build into this. So I don't know what's a good, what should be a reverie and what should be a freebie, because I just don't think that that's the right question to be asking. I think the right question to be asking is, there are some core basic sort of attributes or human capabilities that all humans must have. Amartya Sen's capability framework kind of describes precisely this: our ability to exploit our potential to the best of our ability, human capability, which requires fundamental investments in our ability to be equal participants in the economic and social sphere. That means ensuring that we are not there is no hunger, that we have a certain standard of nutrition that is available to all, that we have a certain standard of education that is available to all, that we have a certain standard of quality healthcare that is available to all, and that we provide a broad framework of risk protection that allows individuals to be able to move and exploit exploit their potential within the market in the best way possible. You and I, when we talk to our employers for jobs, we talk about PF, we talk about gratuity, or we talk about not having any of those so we can invest in markets, so we have a pension fund, etc. We basically talk about employment protection of a certain kind. That is not an employment protection that India offers to the bulk of its workers, nearly 90% who work in the unorganized sector. So these are the questions that, to my mind, we should be asking. What is it about the nature of our welfare system that is not investing appropriately here? Which takes me to the question that was asked about health and education. On the why we are not investing in health and education, it's a puzzle in and of itself. But perhaps one way, and in fact, I've been doing, for a different research study, a historical look at education investments, the nature of education policy in India since the Kothari Commission, school education policy. And one of the things that really strikes me is the absence of a political ownership over education policy. And it's only recently I can think of two political parties that have invested in education. One was in the first term in Bihar, 2005 to 2010, Nitish Kumar, who really put his political capital behind improving the quality of school education, or the infrastructure more at that point, of school education in Bihar. In fact, one of his big innovations was around this question of how do you reduce the number of out-of-school girls in schools in Bihar. And he innovated with this idea of cycles. So today in North India, you go to any rural area, you will see states picked it up. You will see girls in school uniforms riding their bike to school or not is an open question, but riding the bike nonetheless. And in fact, it was showed up in the numbers. Bihar had the fastest reduction of out-of-school girls in that phase compared to any other part of India. And the other interesting exception is Delhi. I've been studying Delhi schools quite closely. And what really is interesting to me about what the government of Delhi has done in schools in Delhi is that it has consistently and constantly spoken about the potential of government schools to in fact improve and show better results than private schools. A lot of this is political blare, but what that does to the possibilities of our imagination, that we can actually invest in the public system, and the public system with investment can turn around, is a really, really powerful element of what can strengthen our imagination of the possibilities of building strong public systems. No country in the world has increased has improved its economic productivity and stayed firm on the path of growth without these very fundamental investments in people. India is unique in that sense, and it is only to our disadvantage. We are currently sitting on a demographic dividend of having a bulk of youth in the ages of 15 to 40, and 15 years down the line, that demographic dividend will start reducing, because we will slowly enter the phase of becoming an aging population. And we know from economic theory that growth happens when you are able to capitalize on that demographic dividend. I fear that we are very close to becoming a demographic ticking time bomb rather than a positive dividend because of our inability to invest appropriately. And this brings me to the element of the question of UBI. I think that the debate on UBI has multiple facets to it. What I like about it is the idea of universality, because it is universality that builds a sense of social solidarity. What I'm not so convinced about is whether that is the answer to the challenges of investing in public systems. I will be perfectly comfortable with a UBI that comes 2 decades later, if we continue on a path of 8 to 10% growth, and the state has resources, and we are able to improve the basic foundational capabilities of our public systems to deliver on core public on core services to all citizens, to ensure that all citizens have minimum standards of public services, then a UBI that overlayers onto it is a perfectly sensible thing to do. And technology and the emergence of technology and what it's doing to the labor market may well push us in that direction. But a UBI for India today is not the solution, simply because I believe we have to urgently and critically invest in our public systems.
Madam, the same thing about the health education, you gave examples. How about health, madam? The schemes like Aragyasri or Ayushman or actually make the patients go to the private hospitals, and the government hospitals are getting deprived. So any examples of where intensive efforts are made in improving public health?
So again, I think, India is a large country and you have a lot of variation. I was just talking about this with a colleague who has done a survey on citizen expectation of health systems, and Tamil Nadu, she said, people were most discontented with the quality of public health services, and we scratched our heads and say, but Tamil Nadu has amongst the best public primary centers and public health centers, and came to the conclusion that when the government delivers, people want more, and that's where discontent generates, rather than when the government doesn't deliver. So to me, look, to my mind, I think there are two things. There are, in states where there has been some foundational investment in primary health, you do see a robust use of the primary health system, and you can see that primary health system delivers. Tamil Nadu is a classic example of just that. At the same time, in states which don't have a strong public health system, you see a lot of breakdown in that system. So there's a lot of evidence that we have today that tells us very important things about the quality of healthcare that India accesses. A large percentage of India doesn't go to the formal health system. It goes to what we call the informal providers, the people who are lab assistants or chemists in a hospital, set up their own little private practice, and people tend to go there to local doctors, etc. The second aspect of it, so in some senses, you have a lot more private health than you have public health. The second aspect of the public health of the health system that we know from data is that there's a large amount of absenteeism of public doctors in the public health systems, that the nature of the effort that the MBBS doctor in the public health system puts in is far lower than the nature of the effort that an unqualified private doctor puts in their health in their clinics. That the quality of care is extremely is extremely wanting. And in fact, some important work suggests that the same doctor in the public clinic will spend less time and is less likely to correctly diagnose a disease than he is if he uses the public center as a referral for the private clinic that they run. In many states, you can also run a private clinic later on, and in the private clinic, same patient will get a higher chance of a better diagnosis. So the nature of the public system is remarkably broken, but there are some very important success stories. I think the National Rural Health Mission ensured that there is an ASHA in almost every village. And with all the limitations of the quality of care of the ASHA, etc., the presence of the ASHA has been a huge improvement in the visibility of what the public health system can do. And we saw during COVID how effectively this contributed. In fact, our ability to vaccinate as fast as we did owes almost everything to the presence of the ASHA and the ANM in the village. So I think that's one way to interpret that is that when you do invest in the public system, whether it's in the health worker or in the overarching health system itself, you do see some really positive results. More recently, we've been seeing some really good results from the health and wellness centers that have been set up via Government of India funding. So the system can work, but for the system to work, we have to put money into it, and we have to put, above all, perhaps our belief into it.
Thanks, madam. Another question in terms of have we succeeded in judicially enforcing the rights-based welfare, especially with rights to food and work? Has the judiciary been responsive?
So, of course, I think that one of the conceptual challenge with the rights-based welfare has always been the question of enforceability. What are parts of administrative functions of the state that can genuinely be enforceable, and what are parts that are not? And this has always been a tension in rights-based welfare legislation in India. And in fact, it's quite interesting to see that the enforceable elements of the rights-based welfare have actually been mostly ignored. So take the National Rural Employment Guarantee aspect. The most enforceable element of that was the idea of an unemployment insurance, that if the state cannot provide you with work within 15 days, then it is the obligation of the state to provide you with an unemployment guarantee, an unemployment insurance, so to speak. But that is the most ignored aspect of the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Most ignored. In fact, now everybody has even forgotten about it. Wages, at least linking wages given through the NREGA to minimum wages, that too has for the most part been ignored. So even the enforceable aspects haven't effectively been enforced, and a lot of that has to do with weak state capacity. So I don't think that the argument is that rights legislation can ensure greater efficiency immediately in a low capacity environment. I think the argument is that in a low capacity environment, you have to build the capacity of the state regardless. And the question is, what is the imagination of that capacity building? In the tech imagination, it is technology that can cut through the state and bypass it to deliver cash directly to people. In the rights imagination, it's about investing in the health system, in the public system. And let's not forget, as I've tried to explain, the cash system may well work when it comes to private goods that are publicly funded, but it does not work when it comes to core public systems like health and education.
One more question has come. One learns that the USA has an elaborate social security payment system for senior citizens. How would you look at such a system for India? Wouldn't it be intrinsically acceptable given that the American market has accepted it?
The American market is primarily formal. The Indian market is the Indian labor market is largely informal. So that has been the whole puzzle about welfare in India, that it doesn't talk about labor bargaining power in that sense, because most labor operates in the informal economy and has no formal employment protection of any kind. I think that's the fundamental difference. And so, where India has provided pensions, it has done so through targeted fiscal response, with the exception, of course, of government employment, where pensions are, in fact, government employees are amongst the largest proportion of formal employees in India that actually have a access to pension, and that's where a lot of the debate that we are seeing right now on the old pension scheme versus the new pension scheme has sort of unfolded. But coming back to the India story, we actually have a very thin pension structure. The National Old Age Pension Scheme, I think, has been stuck at, if I'm not wrong, 250 or 300 rupees per beneficiary. State governments have topped it up. In some states, it's much more robust than others. Rajasthan had passed a minimum income guarantee law before the elections and had substantively increased the old age pension that the state government was giving. But it remains a very, very critical area. And as I said, the challenge for India lies in the fact that it is doing this largely in an environment where we don't have formal social protection baked into our employment structure, baked into the nature of the structure of the labor market. And fixing that is going to be a huge problem. Related to that, even our pension system is much more capable of delivering in rural areas and not in urban areas. So there's a huge structural breakdown actually in our welfare architecture, which has a lot more visibility in rural India and far less in urban. And we know from, particularly so vividly from our COVID experience, how much of rural India actually comes to urban India to work. And they live in urban India in very precarious circumstances with absolutely no forms of risk protection. So that if the switch of the economy turns off, even, in COVID, it was extreme, but in the everyday lives of workers, the switch of your employment can turn off at any second because you're contractual, you're informal, you have no rights. And so as a consequence, workers live in remarkably precarious circumstances, and that has to change.
Okay, thanks, ma'am. Of course, another question, though not directly social welfare spending, but how do we link the recent farmer union demands with the social welfare programs like the MSP and pension for the farmers? So how do we look at it?
So I don't see, I think the biggest mistake we make in our debate on farmers is that we consider the MSP, we debate the MSP in the framework of welfare. Agriculture is one of the most critical sectors of the Indian economy. Critical because it is the largest employer. Critical because it is core to our food security. Critical also because even though it is the largest employer, it has substantively failed to increase its productivity. So its contribution to GDP has sort of remained stuck at about at a far lower percentage. Gross value added, I think, is about 14%. I could be wrong. We need to think about what we do with agriculture, less in the framework of welfare and much more in the framework of what is it that we need to do to enhance the productivity of agriculture in a way that it contributes more robustly to the Indian economy and to our food security. And I think of, in that context, I see the MSP not as a subsidy to the farmer, but as a critical price stabilizer. Across the globe, farmers, agriculture is the most risky sector of the economy because it has to deal with risks of weather, with risks of disease, and so on. And it has always, and because it is so critical to food security, it has always been dependent on support. The agriculture market has never been completely laissez-faire. It has always been dependent on state support of different forms. The MSP was built out in India very much as part and parcel of that risk protection set of support that was provided to the sector. And one element of that risk protection was price stabilization. Now, in the current moment, of course, the MSP has certainly gotten perverted in some senses with the excess focus on rice and wheat, and particularly the way in which, given the nature of the Green Revolution, the investment that was made in Haryana and Punjab, and particularly with Haryana and Punjab farmers. But I don't think the response to this has to be no MSP. I think the response to this has to be, how do you ensure that the MSP, in fact, has a much wider kind of a production base that deals with the critical problem that India confronts right now of the urgent need for crop diversification. All of us who live in Delhi can barely breathe for 3-4 months of the year because of farm burning. That farm burning is coming on account of an ecological consequence of investments that were made via the Green Revolution to ensure our food security back in the 70s. And the need for the farmer now to diversify is crucial. And in fact, the MSP can be used as a very, very critical incentive to do so. So I think we have to think about the MSP very differently to other kinds of welfare subsidies.
Thank you, madam. Thanks for that response. I think the questions are over from the audience. Any other area you would like to make comments, madam?
I think we've covered quite a wide range. I hope some of this was useful. There was one question that was asked about taxes, whether an optimal solution would be that taxes that the poorest should. I mean, we cannot continue with a tax structure that is so heavily dependent on indirect taxation and so significantly reduces the role of direct taxes. So I certainly think that there is a need for inversion and for reduction of the debate on tax breaks should be very much around core services that are, or core goods that are required for the poor, rather than on corporate taxes. But it is ultimately, it's about the extent to which we are willing in India to have a discourse around taxation and redistribution, and I think we are many decades away from that.
Okay, ma'am. I think we'll close the session. Let me see the YouTube. Oh no, there are no more questions from the YouTube also. So we'll close the session.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, madam. Thanks for the wonderful exposition. You presented the social welfare spending in different dimensions, both as the rights and empowerment approach, and also public and private and merit goods and all those things. Thanks a lot, madam, for your wonderful exposition. I also thank our technical expert Sadiq and design team of Shreya and others for the wonderful poster that was made. And for next month, we'll be having the next webinar is on 31st of March. This will be on the West Asian, Palestine-Israel conflict and West Asian issue. So that will be again at 11 o'clock on 31st of March. And I thank all the audience that are there on the YouTube and all my colleagues who helped me in organizing it. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pradeep, you can disconnect.